Hi everybody. This video is for those of you who are taking the pencil workshop with me shortly. So what I've done is work through hopefully some of the behaviors of pencil, some of the things you can do. I mean, it's limitless, as you know, but some of the key things, and hopefully some things that will encourage you to be more experimental and more courageous, if you like, in the way you use pencil. So do have a look at this. You can see from my fingers here what has been going on, and it will be like that. The workshop will be encouraging you to not get messy, but to mess around a little bit more than maybe you do, in order to discover the potential of this stuff. So have a good look at the video. Hopefully you enjoy it, and take it on board, and maybe practice some of the little things that I've shown you before the day of the workshop, and then we'll build on those on the day. We're going to have a look at the qualities of pencil here, if it doesn't slide away. Simple, humble little pencil. This is a 6B, mind you, so it's a fairly black, fairly dark pencil, which has allowed me to get some nice ranges of tone. And I would generally advise you, if you're working with pencil, to not use anything certainly less than 2B. As you get higher, 3B, 4B, 5B, and so on, that increases the density of the pencil, the darkness, the blackness of the pencil. If you go the other way to the H side, HB, H2H, it becomes hard. So H for hard, and therefore the lines you have will be much lighter. So keep that in mind. You'll also notice here, if you look, that, you know, if you look at the size of my hand in relation to the screen, this area here is really quite a small area. So if you look, that's a little stubby pencil I'm using, so it's a small area of drawing. And that's another thing to keep in mind. Very important to think about scale, because sometimes people use a pencil and they buy an A2 sketch pad, which is a really very, very big sketch pad, and they try to draw on this big area with a little pencil. And for me, the pencil in most cases works well when it's worked within its scale. It's a small object, therefore the drawings are better when they're used within a confined, smaller area. And hopefully you'll see this as we go on. I'll have some examples, hopefully. The pencil itself behaves very like charcoal in many ways. In other ways, it's very, very different. But the principles of gesture, angle, and pressure are similar. So, as we've spoken, those of you doing the charcoal workshop, but if you're not, I'll remind you that if we think about the G, which is gesture, I can make lines with a pencil slowly and very evenly like that. That's the gesture of my hand. Or I can make lines which are very fast and uneven. You can see the speed of my hand here. You can see the sort of gestures I'm making. Imagine that there could be some material. It could be pieces of wool or trees or grass or whatever. I can make other gestures which are broken. The broken lines. This literally feels like playing with a pencil, which is what it is, except we're trying to look carefully at what we're doing here. This is the emphasis on these workshops. So we can make all different gestures, movements with our arms. We can move slowly I'm moving from my shoulder, so I'm making a nice gentle sweep. Whereas if I move from my thumb here, look, my thumb and my finger in and out like that. Watch the thumb and forefinger going in and out, and look at the little marks and the surfaces that I'm making with that movement compared to the movement where I'm swiping from the joint in my shoulder. So gesture is very important. That's what creates all of these different effects, for want of a better word. The angle of the pencil, as we know, is important. If we hold it upright, of course, we're going to get a fine point, particularly if it's been sharpened. So you see that nice crisp line there. if I tip it down slightly at an angle, if you can see that dropping to an angle, and move it around like that, the line is slightly thicker, you'll see that. If I bring it down right flat, nearly flat against the page, you can see what happens. It becomes much thicker and softer and fuzzier. Look at the line that's happening there, that sort of grey, almost like a charcoal line. So that's a different quality of line to this little fine, wiry line that I made when I had my pencil full on. So, the angle that we hit the paper at is important. The pressure, of course, we know that. I'm sure anyone who's ever used a pencil knows if I very gently take and hold at the end of the pencil, for example, the further back we hold a tool like a pencil or charcoal or a pen or whatever, the less pressure we can apply, because the pressure is transferred over a longer distance. So if I hold it here, it's harder for me to dig into the paper, if you like. So therefore, the lines that I can get, you can see, or maybe just about see, the ghostly little line that I make in there. And it makes sense. If I move my fingers up towards the point now, I can dig in a bit more and I can make a line which is so much darker. If I turn the pencil upright, as we did here, so we're going straight down onto the page, we're stabbing at the page, all the pressure is being applied to the point directly downwards, not sidewards. If we do that, dig in and press hard, you can see that we're making a line that's maybe even slightly darker than the previous one. And all of these things probably seem in some ways obvious to us, because we've used pencils all of our lives since we were children probably. But the difference in using it as an artist, as a painter, or whatever, and using it as a child, is that we are analysing all of this. We're thinking about the movement of our hands. And those of you who have maybe been with me before on workshops of this nature have heard me saying this before. Be aware of what's happening in my finger here. What's going on in the muscles that makes that happen? What's going on in the muscles of my shoulder that makes that happen? What's going on in the pressure of the muscles and the tension that makes a line like this, as opposed to that beautiful little thread-like line? Because these are the lines that will create the effects of leaves or trees or whatever it is. So keep these qualities of line in mind, qualities of mark making, I should say, in mind when you're making your drawings. Another area of interest with regards to pencil and I suppose any medium is how we deal with areas of shading. So in the previous little section there, we focused mostly on lines and marks, but we maybe also want to think about whole areas. So, if I have a complete area here that I want to occupy with shading, pressure becomes an important factor there. But obviously we're mostly been taught as children and whatever that we fill in, we colour in with pencil. So that's basically what I'm doing here. I've just coloured in this sort of area with an even wash of the pencil mark, and we've all done that. We all know about that. But going back to this business of being aware of what you're doing and what you're doing with your muscles and your angles and so on, that this is where we can begin to practice the control of these areas. So, for instance, I can control from this and relax my muscles slowly until it goes back to where I was there, to create that gradation of shading. So in other words, if I was to do it here on this little area and begin again, really, really tense, really dark, and then I'm relaxing the muscles in my thumb and finger. I'm now relaxing the muscle in my elbow, if there is a muscle in your elbow, and I'm now relaxing as far as I can towards the end. So as I moved across, you can see the tension in my fist there. It relaxed and opened up and allowed me to create this. So these these things can be repeated, and these are exercises you really should repeat. So tense muscles in the hand, let go of your thumb and forefinger, let the hand relax, then start to move from the wrist, then start to move from the elbow and then the shoulder until that becomes pale, because you're not applying the same tenseness that you did at the very beginning. So that, again, seems like a very simple process. It is a simple process, but it's just unfortunately not a process that people bother to go through, because they're so keen to get to pictures that people will look at in a frame that they're ignoring this, which is our language, our words. Okay, we can fill areas in other ways. We don't need to fill it in that way, of course. We can use the gestures that we talked about earlier, you know, that we can have gestures like this, we can gestures like that, different movement. So I can take this little rectangle and say, okay, I'm going to use a gesture. So I'm going to use a squiggly gesture. So I'm going to fill this up. So up in this top corner, I'm leaning quite heavily, but it's a different sort of mark. It's a squiggly mark. And now I'm beginning to relax my thumb and forefinger a little bit, but still maintaining that squiggly mark. I'm really glad I had plenty of coffee this morning, because I can get this jitteriness out of me. And I'm relaxing a wee bit more. I'm now moving a little bit more from my shoulder, actually. Still trying to create a squiggly mark, but look, because I'm not applying the pressure, it's becoming paler and paler, and now I'm moving completely from the shoulder, where I can't get the same pressure as I do from the thumb and forefinger. But the movement's still there. I can go back and maybe start to get in a wee bit more, tense up about halfway, and really, when I get that top corner, really dig in and squiggle, 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 squiggle. And we can see that we're getting a lovely gradation from dark to light, but with a lovely surface, which could be a piece of stone, or could be a piece of leaf or fabric, piece of velvet, I don't know, whatever. But we're combining this idea with the idea of material because of the gesture that we're making. And of course, we can fill boxes with any sorts of gestures. We can create exercises, and this is what I would recommend you doing. A different gesture. I don't know. Let's say I do this. So lots of dots this time in the top corner. Very hard. You can hear the noise. And as I move across diagonally, I'm trying to relax my thumb and finger. You can hear the noise is maybe a little less obvious. And as I come down here, I'm trying to relax this more. And it's not easy, because you have to think about what's happening in your muscles. And as I come back here and get really tense there, and you can see that's a slightly different patchy mark to what we had here, and certainly here, but the idea is the same. It's about light and shade, but done with a different gesture. And this can go on and on and on. There's lots of, you find loads of ways to do that. We can also build up tone and surfaces with what's known as cross-hatching. And again, I would guess that many of you are familiar with that, because basically a lot of us have been taught to shade in lines. So, you know, in school or whatever, I know I was taught, you know, build up shading this way in a series of lines. So if we think about that, make use of that. So I can fill this rectangle with a series of diagonal lines across that, which of course creates a grey over that. Then of course, if I overlap that with another series of lines, so if I go that direction, say about halfway, so if I begin to put a series of lines that way, all the way to about the halfway line, you can see that I have now got two layers of lines. The consequence is that that obviously looks darker than that. And again, totally logical stuff, but how often do we think about it and practice it? Let's say, for instance, I go over about halfway this one with lines going that way. So if at this time I build up another set of lines across the top of these, which is about the halfway point of that. We now have 1, 2, 3 tones, all built up, directional lines, one over the other, one over the other, and so on. And eventually, of course, it would build up to the point where you may not even be aware of the lines, because the lines become so close together that it just becomes an area of grey, and that's fine, that's normal enough. And for instance, I can go then this direction with a series of lines, maybe halfway across that way, and you can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4 tones. So it's a very systematic way of creating tone. The difference being that each set of lines, I'm using the same pressure on my hand, unlike the previous section where, if you remember, we were playing with the idea of very, very tense and then relaxing and relaxing until we got lighter tones here. It was to do with how hard I was pressing. This, I'm pressing the same amount in each series of lines. What's given me the variation of tone is the fact that one layer of lines is going on top, and so on, and building it up. So there's two different approaches to creating a variety of tones here. I'm just going to use the same sheet of paper here to follow on a little bit, something that might have been included in the earlier section, but we'll do it now. In a similar way to charcoal, pencil can be rubbed with your finger. In other words, if I put down a mark here and simply rub it, you can see the blurriness, the dirt basically that comes off that. It depends again on the paper. If the paper is very smooth, it might behave differently compared to a paper which is like a watercolor paper. This is a sort of a medium cartridge paper. It's got a bit of a grain to it, so it's kind of nice. But you can see that it is possible, just like charcoal, to create marks with the rubbing of pencil. Now, you can put an area of pencil like that, and of course, if you rub around that, you'll get this sort of halo of misty, sort of grey tone. You can, I suppose, also think about variations of pencil blurriness, if you like. I'm going to put a few remarks down there so I can have a little reservoir of the actual graphite as it is to be able to rub. So if I rub on that, and of course there's some in my finger or on my finger as well, I can rub hard, I can rub lightly, and you can see I'm trying to push it as far as I can, and we might need more pencil on there, but you can, I guess, create the illusion of soft surfaces, maybe clouds, maybe cotton, I don't know, whatever, but it's quite useful. What I would be careful of is a habit that a lot of students in my days in college tended to use this method, and what it did was they avoided concentrating on tone and the subtleties of tone. What I mean by that is they might have, I'll just draw a little circle here, they might have been drawing a ball or a spherical shape. So what they would have done was they would have put a wee bit of shading on one side, like that, quite dark. So they'll say, oh, that's the dark side of the ball. And then they would have gone in with their finger and rubbed hard there and rubbed slightly lighter on the far side until they got this soft gradation of tone to make the thing look like a ball. It did in many cases, but in many cases it was pot luck, because rubbing with your finger doesn't always guarantee some control. So it wasn't the most accurate thing. Whereas if they were drawing a ball or an orange or an apple in front of them, observing it, it's a bit hit and miss, because you just don't really know for sure when you rub pencil, exactly how it's going to behave. Yes, you can see there's a light on that side and a dark on that side, but really, if it's observation you want, if it's accuracy you want, you may be better taking the point of your pencil and going back to that business of pressure of the muscles of your hand to control it. So you can see I am gently shading from light to dark very, very lightly here. When I come over to the right hand side, I'm just digging in a wee bit more pressure. And you can see that slowly I'm creating a much more controlled, graduated form, whereas the smearing with the finger was a little bit hit and miss. So what I'd say is, yes, this sort of method is useful perhaps when you're making sketches of landscapes and things, and absolutely. But if you want some accuracy of form, then you're probably best taking the time to build up with the systematic marks. What I'm doing here is having a think about erasing of marks. You know, those of you who've looked at the video about charcoal will see about that as well. But the ability of pencil to be removed after it's down. So what I've been doing here is just basically filling in a great big circle with pencil. So I've filled that whole area pretty much in. The other thing while we're working at this level is to have a think about the fact that pencil is transparent. So I have this solid big mass of darkness here, but remember, I can wash lightly over this. So I'm just putting a very light wash. I'm not pressing too hard, just over the top of that. And you can see that, of course, it doesn't destroy the circle that I've just shaded. It basically puts a wash over the top of it, like you might with watercolor. So you can see that this shape is now underneath a layer of that other wash of tone that I put on. But if we were to take a rubber stroke eraser, remember that we can remove lines. You can see there, just as we've done with other materials, we can take that right out. So I can actually then maybe create the light from the dark with the rubber. So you can see there, if I rub that heavily up here, I'm making quite a light mark. I'm taking it right down nearly to the paper. And again, the paper determines that. Some papers will allow you to rub away very, very well. Others, it's a wee bit more difficult. This is not too bad. But then as I move across the form, I'm going to rub more and more lightly. Just like when I was putting pencil on, I can put it on with a lot of pressure or not so much pressure. So I can take the rubber, not rubbing too hard here, but I'm just enough to take some of the pencil away. It's also, you notice, blending the pencil together a little bit. You might notice that. And then here, hardly at all. So I'm leaving this untouched. I'm rubbing that a little bit. Every now and again, just clean the rubber. You see, like that, rub it on a piece of sandpaper or even just another piece of card or whatever, so that cleans it up. We can now rub away. You can see it beginning to disappear. A little bit there. And then here, let's see how we can clean the rubber a bit more. See how high we can get the highlight. And you can see there that we're creating some sense of 3 dimensions into it. So what was a flat black area, a dark area, is now becoming something that could be a ball or a spherical form, a 3-dimensional form. So you can see that there. You might even get, as you very often do, if it's a reflective object, you might have a little bit of reflected light down at the other side of a ball. So you can see that shininess that we're getting there. And of course, we can play around with removing patterns in the background if we want to. If you really want to mess around with that, we could take perhaps and take away that shading, put light in this side, which allows the dark side of the form to come forward. So we're now creating a 3-dimensional form with the use of the rubber rather than the pencil itself. Now, just following on from talking about transparency a little while ago, I just want to do one more little thing with regards to that. The ability of the pencil to be transparent. And again, that transparency can be controlled by the grade of the pencil. As I said, this is a 6B. It's a very, very black, very dark, sort of a a pencil really, but I have other pencils that here. There's one here, that's an H pencil. So you can see, if I put a little mark up at the top here, you know, I'm leaning quite heavily, but it's not exactly getting super strength because of an H. This is my 6B, and you can see immediately the difference between those two tones. So these can be sort of used one against the other if you want, and we'll maybe try that in a moment. But what I want to show you is that if I just play with some shapes, transparent shapes, so if I was to take, I'm going to make a little shape, let's say house shape or whatever, and we'll fill that in reasonably dark. Okay, it's just a little simple shape. So I'm filling it in all sorts of different directions, okay? And then if I come in and lean more lightly, so, and wash across that, you can see what's happening. So I'll wash a little area across there, just that top section of the thing, and you can see that below that wash is still visible this little house shape, this little chimney pot shape. Down here it's still, you know, slightly lighter, so I'll maybe carry that over a little bit more. What I might do then is make another shape down here, so a little rectangle, this time maybe darker. So I'm going to lean on that. I'm going to really fill that in over the top of that section. So I'm playing around with different shapes. They're totally random, and hopefully it'll make sense in a wee minute or two. Then again, what I could do is take my H pencil, and if you see what happens here, I'll wash over this area with the H pencil. You can see that it's much harder, much lighter, but it's actually making an indent in the paper slightly there as well. But you can see the difference. That shines through very easily because the H pencil is so weak, or dilute if you like, compared to this bold pencil. So different degrees of pencil hardness can create different things. Let's say we fill in that little area here a wee bit, and then maybe over here we'll put some of the H pencil in. You can actually hear the difference in the sound because it's so hard. It's rubbing harder against the paper, if you like. You can see the nice pale grey we can get compared to that. So I can play around overlapping these shapes, but you see that they're transparent. As I'm washing the H pencil there, all of that big bold, the 6B is still underneath that. So it's a bit like watercolor paint. Say I go on top of this H area with another little area of H. You can see that that's making it slightly darker in that area, but it's in below. So there's layering beginning to happen here. And we can keep on doing that with different pencils, just to occupy shape. So I can wash over this corner. So one is going over another, going over another. You can see they're slowly overlapping each other in different ways. And maybe a wee bit more of an H over here, let's say. And maybe a very dark area over the H. So let's put an area over here on top of that. Okay, and then let's wash another area over the top of that. So you can see that if you really, really look, this one tone shines through the other. We're building up layers, building up layers. What I'd like to point out then is if I was to make that into something, let's say I now create a bit of a rectangle around that. You know, and you can see, because we're trying to find out, well, what's the use of this transparency? What is it good for? Well, you know, if we were to take something like this, and if I was to take a very bold line here and a bold line there and say, this is a window with reflections in it, you can see, hopefully, how that could work. I'll put a little windowsill in there just for fun. But do you see that we could create that illusion of a reflection of a building in the window because of the transparency? And of course, remember that we can also bring the rubber into play, and we can lift out a few little lights that you might get on a window. So I can, let's say, rub that back there, the way we might get occasional highlights shining on the side of a window. Do you see that? So these little broken up suggestions of reflections in a glass are created through the transparency, the quality of transparency that pencil is capable of. And that could be a glass of wine or a glass of water, as well as glass could be reflections on a piece of metal, a piece of silver, and so on. I mean, I can take and, you know, reinforce this highlight a bit more, look. And maybe that could have been a bowl or a cup or something like that. I mean, I only need to change, you know, the shape of that. I could change that into a circular shape and it's something else again. So the layering of pencil is a very beautiful thing, and have a think about that also. What I want to talk about now is this stuff, which is graphite. Graphite is basically the stuff that's in a pencil. You can see it shining there in the light, except it's a solid mass, so there's no wood around it or anything like that. It's just a solid chunk of that graphite. It is covered in a slightly plasticky kind of a paint, which you just can scrape off with a knife or a sharpener. But basically it's more solid. It's like a piece of charcoal, and you can see there where I've sharpened the tip part of this down to it's quite flat. So it's capable, just like a pencil, and that's exactly like a pencil, that little line there, of a fine line and all the other things that a pencil line can do. But it's also capable, like a charcoal, or a piece of charcoal, of creating, you can see these broad marks on the side of it, like a piece of charcoal. But it has a lovely transparency that pencil has. You can see there the charcoal would maybe not have. So you have a, if you like, the best of both worlds in some ways. And it's also very good to overcome sometimes the fear of drawing. A lot of people who begin to draw, especially with a pencil, you know, we draw very nervously around the edges of things and we hope that it's all right. Whereas when we take a piece of graphite, we can draw, you know, things more confidently. We can, you know, draw shapes and circles and all of that, and really get into the drawing and the marks that we're making. So graphite is something I would recommend, and something that we're going to use in the workshop. So, but I would recommend that you generally buy yourself some of it, just to experience it if you haven't already done so. What I'm doing now, as you can see, is I'm simply just rubbing a whole area with the flat end of the graphite. This is, I think, is a 2B. Graphite comes just like pencil, 2B, 4B, whatever, blacker or harder. So you can have, say, 6B, which is really black, dark, and is lovely to work with if you really want something bold. But what I'm doing here is I'm just deliberately rubbing, filling up a dark area. I'm talking about marks. Look at the marks that I'm getting here. There's accidental scratch marks that are happening there on this card that are lovely, and could be very useful if we were drawing from something with a certain surface. So as I'm preaching, if you like, over and over again, think as you go. You know, as I'm going, I'm watching and seeing, oh, look what happens here. Look what I can do, or maybe even look what I can't do with this stuff. But you can see I've tried to block in this big area of dark. The reason being that, coming back to this whole idea of erasing and rubbing away with a rubber stroke eraser, you can see that if I draw lines into this, you can take out parts. So just like charcoal, we can do the same thing. And it's a bit slidier than charcoal graphite, as you can imagine. But if we work at this here, we can rub away little sections of that there. And you can see the light coming through. What I've done here is I've cut away a little piece of rubber to try and make a little thin area, you know. So if I rub that, you can see that I can create little finer marks. Turn it around the other way. rub it that way, you can see a little bit there. You can see it actually, this whole idea of rubbing just like charcoal as well. So if I rub that gently with my fingers, it's changing that. It's rubbing the graphite over the top of those light areas. There's a light area that I've left behind. There's one that's just gone a little bit paler, grey or whatever. So we can actually feel like it's painting with rubbing and erasing and rubbing with our fingers. You can see there. Sometimes what you've got to do, if you notice down here, I'm rubbing on the edge of an old piece of card here to take away the dirt from the end of the rubber. You can imagine what's happening is I'm picking up graphite. So you have to keep doing that so that when we go back in, it will take away areas. But by combination of rubbing and pushing around and maybe even adding some more graphite lines here, you can see, for example, grass. Obviously grass is the first thing that comes in to our mind here when we're looking at this, or at least with me anyway. And then I can go back in and rub some light bits away. And it is quite a physical activity, you know. So I'm taking a large amount of that away, but then I can go back in with the graphite. And one of the things we talk about is, you know, if we're drawing grass or fabric or something, you know, that there are light lines against dark. It's not always dark against light. So now that I fill in these gaps, I have a lovely area where there's the occasional lovely sliver of light coming out of it. So there's all sorts of combinations possible. If I rub at this, for instance, just as an experiment, how much can I rub until it completely disappears? And I think that the answer is it may not ever completely disappear, but you can see I'm really trying hard to blend that in. And look at that lovely shadow. That now looks like someone's hair coming around and bending round back into the shadows. If I take and rub the top of it, for example, soften that, it disappears back into space. So you imagine that lovely curve of a lock of hair or something there, all created by the process of graphite, rubbing, scratching. So to achieve that is quite a physical and expressive sort of method. And you know, traditionally, you know, if you're learning to draw, sometimes what happens is, if I can shift this over slightly, sometimes we worry more about, oh, you know, if we're drawing hair or something like that, this is the way we draw it. Scratch, 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 and hope that it eventually gets like that, which it may do. But if you look at that, because I've used the method of rubbing away and wiping and rubbing and replacing, then it's something different. It may be possible, I don't know if I can do this or not, but I'm just wondering if I was just rubbing another little highlight on that and then just rubbing that back in. You see that I've created another little glow. I can then take and just scratch over that slightly so that it belongs with the rest of it. And we're creating that lovely sense of surfaces. Well, hopefully you found that of some interest and use. Now, do take on board what's there and have a go at it. But have a look now, just before the video finishes, at a few examples of how some great artists, how some very respected artists have used pencil, and take that on board as well. See you soon.